How does a game break the company that creates it? That's the story of what happened with Destiny's Lightfall expansion. So today, I want to take a second look at it, exploring why people reacted so negatively and what lessons we can learn from that. I also want to evaluate how it holds up in retrospect, more than 2.5 years later. In early 2023, Lightfall released, and was so poorly received it led to declining sales, loss of player retention, loss of player trust, and layoffs of 100 employees at Destiny developer Bungie. As a result, the next expansion, The Final Shape, was delayed to ensure it didn't disappoint like Lightfall did. In spite of Final Shape receiving near universal critical acclaim, it didn't sell enough to fix Bungie's financial situation, resulting in a second wave of layoffs, with 220 employees losing their jobs and others being absorbed by parent company Sony. Lightfall's negative reception served as the catalyst that exposed issues at Bungie, with alleged mismanagement and tenuous financials being cited as contributing factors to the layoffs. It remains to be seen if Bungie can right the ship and prevent further layoffs or a complete takeover by their parent company, Sony. Based on the reception to the most recent Edge of Fate expansion and declining player numbers, the future doesn't exactly look bright for Bungie. Today, let's take a look at Lightfall and explore why the expansion was so poorly received that it started a downward spiral for Bungie. In this analysis, I will compare Lightfall to the critically acclaimed expansions that came before and after it, to see why it didn't work when Witch Queen and Final Shape did. I think it's important to start with my impressions of Lightfall prior to this reassessment, so that you can understand my headspace going into this analysis. Lightfall was the first expansion that was released after I had fully gotten into Destiny. I had tried to get into the game twice before, once with the launch of Destiny 1, and a second time when Destiny 2 went free-to-play on Steam. I enjoyed both experiences to some degree, but didn't stick around because I didn't have people to play the game with. I returned to Destiny 2 during the summer of 2022 after Witch Queen's release, this time with friends who were willing to take me under their wing and help me learn the game. Over the next few months, I fell in love with Destiny, playing all the story campaigns and learning the raids and dungeons, including Destiny 1 stuff. I was super excited for Lightfall and played through the legendary campaign with my friends when it released. I enjoyed the experience a lot, especially the gameplay, but was on a Discord call with friends, including people who weren't playing with us, so I missed some story elements by being distracted. On social media, I learned that the broader community reaction to Lightfall was much more negative than my first impressions. After spending more time with the campaign, I came to view Lightfall as somewhat underrated, but agreed with many of the criticisms of it. For this video, I replayed Lightfall on my alt account to re-experience all dialogue and cutscenes, so that I could carefully reappraise how the criticism of it holds up more than 2 years later. Spoiler warnings for Witch Queen, Lightfall, and Final Shape. The bulk of this video is going to be focused on the story because that took up the majority of the negative critical reception to Lightfall, but there were a few other factors which I will mention here. The way the campaign handles the new Strand subclass was heavily criticized, as it constantly gives the player access, and then immediately takes it away, using the narrative excuse that the player is overextending themselves to control it. This was frustrating, especially when it's used as a justification for the death of Rohan, who is forced to sacrifice himself after the Guardian is unable to use Strand to destroy the radial mast.
Give me some time to expose its weak point. When I give you the signal, use your Strand! Now's the time! Lightbearer! Destroy it now!
We can't.
Then I have no choice. Nimbus, see you on the other side. Rohan, what are you doing? Rohan!
This led to the scene feeling incredibly contrived, as the only reason Rohan dies is that the writers decided that the player suddenly is unable to use Strand at the critical moment, even though they just activated it moments earlier to defeat the boss. You could potentially make Rohan's sacrifice feel less contrived if the Guardian was able to use Strand, but it failed to destroy the radial mast, forcing Rohan's hand. This wouldn't solve the broader problem with Strand's deployment though, just the most egregious example. Players eventually would receive unrestricted access to Strand after beating the campaign. I think a big part of why the give and take with Strand felt so bad is how fun Strand was to use in the campaign. The new abilities it provided were incredibly fun to play with, especially the grapple ability, which provided a new kind of movement, and a powerful attack when directed at enemies. Ability recharge rates are significantly heightened during sections of the campaign where Strand is utilized, which led to super fun gameplay, enabling a heightened power fantasy. This made the sections where Strand was taken away feel less fun by comparison, heightening the psychological effects of arbitrarily giving it and then taking it away from the player. Bungie evidently learned from this mistake in the final shape by giving access to base prismatic abilities at the end of the first mission. This feels a lot better because it lets the player use their new fun abilities to beat the story campaign. Giving players agency about how they use their new subclass helps avoid the feelings of annoyance felt in Lightfall, caused by limiting Strand to extremely specific parts of the campaign. Lightfall's story is structured in a way where it would have to be fundamentally reworked if you wanted to give unrestricted access to Strand early on, but I think doing so would help make the gameplay even more fun than it already is. As part of an initiative titled Bringing Challenge Back to Destiny, difficulty scaling across the game was changed for most activities, implementing fixed power deltas, preventing players from overleveling activities. While most of the changes were fine, the implementation lacked consistency, as Neomuna Patrol's difficulty scaling was way out of band, leading combat to feel more difficult than raids or dungeons. This seemed backwards, as raids are supposed to be the most difficult endgame activities in Destiny, and patrol zones are typically the easiest content. Meanwhile, the new Root of Nightmares raid was much easier than previous raids, with a record number of clears during the 48-hour contest mode. This was because the raid was very mechanically simple. Most fire teams solo or duo the mechanics of 3 of the 4 encounters, leaving the other 4 or 5 players to do nothing except kill enemies, leading to a rise in players who went into the raid looking for a carry, rather than to participate in all aspects of the raid. Root of Nightmares was so easy that players were able to complete it entirely solo within a couple months of its release. This is very atypical for Destiny raid, as soloing a raid is sometimes possible, but often requires very complicated glitches and exploits to achieve. Root of Nightmares can be soloed relatively easily, without using major glitches or exploits. Lightfall was the second expansion to have a legendary campaign, an optional increased difficulty designed for veteran shooter players that would give increased rewards for the effort. In Witch Queen, the legendary campaign received critical acclaim, due in part to novelty, but also by providing a caliber of combat challenge and encounter design that hadn't been present in previous Destiny campaigns. Aside from the Strand issue, the gameplay of Lightfall's legendary campaign was on par with Witch Queen, and was incredibly engaging and fun. In particular, the addition of the new enemy type, the Tormentor, spiced up combat by serving as a significant threat. Before getting used to their attack patterns and learning to counter them effectively, Tormentors were quite imposing, and provided a new sense of challenge to combat encounters they were part of. My favorite gameplay sections of Lightfall's campaign include the introduction of Strand at the end of First Contact, the final encounter and Sparrow section of Downfall, pretty much all of Hypernet Current, the headlong time trial, and the defense of the Veil complex in Desperate Measures. However, However, the enjoyable aspects of Lightfall's gameplay were largely overshadowed by its key failing: the story. The best received Destiny expansions usually have critically acclaimed stories, with The Taken King, Witch Queen, and Final Shape being examples of this. The quality of the story tends to correlate with sentiment about the expansion as a whole because the narrative drives a sense of meaning. If that meaning is lacking, it can sour an otherwise enjoyable gameplay experience and make players less likely to continue playing the post-campaign content. For me, the criticisms of Lightfall's narrative can be boiled down to 4 main points: pacing, setup, tone, and canon. Let's begin with Lightfall's pacing. In 2020, Bungie announced 3 expansions at once that were said to be building towards a moment of climax in an era of darkness. Beyond Light, Witch Queen, and Lightfall. An alteration to this plan was made in an early 2021 blog post. Game director Joe Blackburn said, "As we began to scale production on the Witch Queen last year, we made the difficult but important decision to move its release to early 2022. We also realized we needed to add an additional unannounced chapter after Lightfall to fully complete our first saga of Destiny." This statement implied that 4 expansions would be needed to complete the story of the Light and Darkness saga, rather than the initially announced 3, so people had high expectations for the story of the final 2 expansions, which would serve as a 2-part conclusion to the saga, Lightfall and Final Shape. However, Lightfall's plot isn't paced very well. It opens with intense urgency as the Coalition fights the Pyramid fleet in the orbit of Earth. The Witness communes with the Traveler and discovers the location of the Veil on Neptune. Then, it sends Callus to Neptune to capture the Veil. The rest of the expansion is a battle on Neptune for the Veil, but it feels very slowly paced. Callus has the Veil surrounded by the end of the second mission, but doesn't directly attack it until the final mission, which leaves the intervening missions feeling like unimportant filler. Callus provides the following justification for it taking so long.
We have captured the Veil. Well, the area around the Veil. It is entombed, so it will take some time to break through and link the relay.
This is a weak justification because the entombment and other implied defenses aren't shown to the player until the final mission, leading it to feel like Callus is over-exaggerating the setbacks he's facing. There are multiple missions where Callus and the Shadow Legion don't make any progress towards their goal. Those missions instead focus on the Vex and Strand subplots. Having Callus reach the Veil immediately then completely halt that forward momentum weakens the Shadow Legion as a threat, because it makes the story feel like it's fallen into a stalemate, and nothing interesting is done narratively to justify one. Finally, Callus decides to move the radial mast to the Veil at the start of the 6th mission, which leaves me wondering why he didn't do that earlier. The Guardian and Rohan intercept and destroy it before it reaches the Veil. Meanwhile, the Witness does essentially nothing except send Callus messages, complaining that he's not capturing the Veil fast enough, instead of helping him complete the mission. The Witness only becomes an active participant in the narrative again when the Guardian kills Callus. The Witness then possesses Ghost, communes with the Veil, creates the portal into the Pale Heart, and enters it. The pacing problems led to a theory that the Final Shape is what Bungie originally planned Lightfall to be, and that Lightfall was invented and inserted between 2 halves of what would originally have been the opening cutscene for that expansion, which is evidenced by the shot compositions of the ending of the opening and beginning of the closing cutscenes, mirroring each other. However, this isn't necessarily evidence of one cutscene being chopped in half, and could just be good cinematography, calling back to the the beginning of the expansion visually to add a sense of symmetry as it ends. Absent someone who was there behind the scenes confirming or denying this theory, we won't ever actually know for sure. Proponents of the invented Lightfall theory often say that Lightfall didn't need to exist, and was only created to squeeze more money out of the player base. Even if this theory is true, I disagree that Lightfall is completely unnecessary as an expansion, in spite of its flaws. The shortened one expansion version of the finale would have to cram a lot of story into a single expansion, which probably would have made the pacing of that expansion worse. Personally, I really like the pacing of Final Shape and worry that it would be worse if Lightfall didn't exist. Lightfall's key purposes are to deal with Callus, introduce the Veil as the opposite of the Traveler to set up the Witness's origin story, explain why the Traveler stayed during humanity's first collapse, and why the Witness has spent 2 expansions avoiding direct conflict with humanity instead of attacking the Traveler right away. The justification for those last 2 are that Savathun hid the Veil on Neptune, and that the Witness can't enact the Final Shape without it. Lightfall also gave Bungie the opportunity to flesh out more disciples, by developing Nezarec as a character in Lightfall's campaign in Root of Nightmares. If we imagine a hypothetical original plan for Lightfall, we likely would only face 2 disciples, Callus and Rulk, first and last, leaving the Pyramid Fleet feeling even more empty than it does currently. I think having Lightfall as an expansion is a good idea, it just needs to be paced better so it doesn't feel like filler. A potential way to improve pacing would be to have Callus slowly advance through Neomuna while facing resistance, finally reaching the Veil just before the 6th mission. This then would make the Guardian and Rohan desperate to destroy the radial mast, prompting Rohan's death. Showing Callus actively working towards his goal as the story progresses would add a sense of forward momentum instead of feeling like the plot stalls in the middle. Another potential fix to the pacing problem would be to make the Witness actively engaged in the story and cut some of the subplots that reduce the urgency. I don't know what the best way to do this would be, but for example, you could introduce a mission where the Vanguard tries to retake control of the airspace surrounding the Traveler from the Witness, instead of letting it just sit there. You could also have the player fight off attacks from Taken and Scorn controlled by the Witness, to give it something to do. You would need to properly motivate those actions as part of the Witness's plans though. Witch Queen's pacing feels good because it's constantly moving towards the conclusion. The plot is mainly driven by the Vanguard investigating Savathun's throne world and trying to discover how she gained the light. Savathun doesn't do much for several missions, but it's eventually revealed that the reason for this is she's watching the Vanguard and using their investigation to recover her memories from before being resurrected as a light bearer. Immediately after this is revealed, she enacts her plan, the ritual to conceal the Traveler in her throne world, which serves as the climax of the story. This helps Savathun feel like an active participant in the story because her inaction is properly motivated and explained. She's acting according to her cunning nature, waiting for the right moment to strike by having the Vanguard do her work for her. Final Shape's pacing feels good for a similar reason. The Witness is actively working towards the Final Shape from the moment the story begins, and almost enacts it in the opening cutscene. The plot of the expansion is again driven by Vanguard action, as they fight their way to the center of the Pale Heart's corruption in order to stop the Witness. This gives the expansion momentum, because each mission you can see the progress made towards the Witness. The Witness also stays active throughout the campaign, continually reaching out to the Vanguard, trying to manipulate them into giving up on their fight to prevent the Final Shape. Likewise, we constantly hear the Traveler wailing, showing that the Witness is manipulating and hurting it, trying to enact the Final Shape. Once the Vanguard figures out how to stop the Witness, they confront it, starting the first of 3 battles that ultimately end in the Witness's defeat. This helps establish the witness as a very potent threat, with the first 2 attacks feeling like they barely succeed. The story always feels like it's moving forwards, and both the protagonists and antagonists feel like they're actively working towards their respective goals the whole time. The second main criticism of Lightfall was that it felt like nothing was explained and the story was too confusing to follow. Generally, in order for a story to be satisfying, it needs to feel logical, like a series of events chained together by cause and effect. In storytelling, the practice of creating this chain is called setup and payoff. To make sure that critical plot moments land successfully, the audience needs to some degree be able to understand what's going on. The practice of creating that understanding by introducing an idea, character, or piece of world building early in the story that will become important later is called setup. The practice of utilizing that setup to create a satisfying story moment is called payoff. A specific example is Chekhov's gun. The idea that if a gun is shown early in the narrative, the audience will expect it to be fired by the story's end. This is just a more specific example of setting something up in advance, so that it's either consciously or subconsciously in the audience's memory when it becomes relevant to the story. Setup can be strengthened by being expanded upon multiple times before payoff, reinforcing the audience's memory. For example, a character could load the gun, indicating they intend to use it later. This helps the payoff feel more satisfying, because it's more likely that the audience will remember the gun. When the audience sees the gun fired, they will remember it being introduced or loaded. Now let's apply this to Lightfall. The core ideas and characters that Lightfall's central conflict hinges on are Callus, the Witness, Neomuna, the Veil, and the Radial Mast. Callus is the most thoroughly set up element of the narrative. He appears in the Leviathan, Eater of Worlds, Spire of Stars, and Crown of Sorrow raids. His motivations and backstory are thoroughly set up by this content, and he's the focus of Season of Opulence, which expands upon his exile. After Season of Opulence, he doesn't make a direct on-screen appearance until Lightfall, but his absence and connection to the Witness are explored in Presage, Season of the Haunted, and Duality. One problem with this is that most of the content that establishes Callus has now been removed from the game, which makes it harder for newer players to understand who he is. Likewise, the Pyramid Fleet is teased in the ending cutscene of the Red War, explored in Shadowkeep, returns to Sol in Season of Arrivals, and takes center stage in Beyond Light. Finally, the Witness is introduced in Witch Queen and appears on screen in the final cutscene, but influences the narrative by sending messages to the player starting in Shadowkeep. The Witness directs events off screen in Season of the Plunder and Seraph, before finally appearing on screen in Lightfall. The Witness's existence is thoroughly set up, but it remains largely mysterious, and we don't learn its origins or motivations until after Lightfall. This hinders the audience's understanding of Lightfall because they don't understand why the Witness is fighting them in the first place. I will return to this point later. Next, let's look at Neomuna. In Season of Plunder, Misrax and Saint 14 feed Osiris Darkness tea, reawakening him and giving him access to Sabathun's memories. He has visions of a hidden city on Neptune. Osiris struggles to get people to believe him throughout Season of the Seraph, but eventually is proven right, as Rasputin discovers erased data from one of his subminds about Neomuna. A final message left after Rasputin's death confirms this, and also sets up the Veil. It reads, "The Neptunian city in Osiris's visions is real. I do not know its exact location, but it is home to the Veil, an object of immense paracausal power. One that is linked to the Traveler. He, Rasputin, imparts this knowledge to use against the Witness in the hopes it may prevent the second collapse." The Witness's main goal in Lightfall is to find and use the Veil to enter the pale heart of the Traveler. However, the audience doesn't fully understand this until the ending cutscene. The Veil is a MacGuffin, which is a plot device that drives the story forwards, usually an object, but lacks meaning outside the story world. The The central conflict of stories involving MacGuffins usually involve fighting for control of them. Famous MacGuffins include the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, the Death Star plans in Star Wars, and the Ark of the Covenant in Raiders of the Lost Ark. You could argue that the Traveler is the most commonly employed MacGuffin in Destiny, as many stories have involved protecting and fighting for control of it. To be employed effectively in a story, a MacGuffin needs to find a delicate balance between being understandable and being shrouded in mystery. If you explain too little, the audience won't understand why parties want to control it, weakening the stakes of the central conflict. But if you explain too much, the audience may find it not compelling or exciting anymore. The most natural way to help the audience understand is to show them why the MacGuffin is important through character action. Utilizing MacGuffins in video games is a bit more complicated than books or movies, as video games are an active medium. They usually ask the player to participate in the story by controlling the protagonist, so you need to give them a strong justification for the actions they're asked to engage in. But in a game where we're asked to control that character, we need to be motivated to act by understanding why we want to control the MacGuffin. Otherwise, players may feel that what the game is asking them to do is poorly justified or confusing. This means it's important that the player have some level of understanding of Lightfall's two main MacGuffins, the Veil and the Radial Mast. The recap cutscene for Lightfall introduces the idea of the Veil, without actually naming the Veil directly. Zavala says,
Savathûn had rebelled against the Witness, and hid what might be our only chance of defeating it away on the planet Neptune.
This introduces the player to the idea of the Veil without explicitly saying that the Veil may be our only chance at defeating the Witness. However, I think this would work better if the Veil was explicitly named here instead of forcing the player to infer that Zavala is talking about the Veil. This idea isn't directly confirmed through dialogue until the Root of Nightmares raid where Nezarec says that Savathûn hid the Veil.
After that witch killed me and cursed my remains, I assume that's when she whisked away the Veil to Neptune.
In the opening cutscene, the Witness attacks the Traveler, then communes with it, receiving a vision of the Veil. Then it says,
Disciple, you know what must be done.
Osiris then explains what just happened.
They found the Veil.
In the first mission, Osiris justifies the importance of the Veil.
If the Witness establishes a link with the Veil, it'll be over for the entire system. All of our losses would have been for naught. We have never faced a threat of this magnitude.
I think this line is slightly too vague. A little bit more detail would go a long way to helping it feel like the importance of the Veil is properly justified. We can infer that what Osiris means is that the Witness will cause society and soul to collapse, and that many will die. However, I think being a little bit more specific and direct would work better here. If Osiris had said something like, if the Witness establishes a link with the Veil, it will enact the final shape, killing millions like the first collapse. We would need no further justification for why the Veil is important. It would be extremely apparent that the Witness's plan is an extinction-level threat, and that it needs to be prevented from controlling the Veil. Currently, a lot of work is being done by previous expansions to establish the Witness as an extinction-level threat, but that isn't ever tied directly into the Veil. Now, I'm not saying explaining it exactly like I outlined is perfect, because I honestly think it's kinda clunky, but it would help without requiring further rewrites. After the first mission, Osiris mentions Callus's plan, saying,
His pursuit of this object, the Veil, is of dire importance. If he gets to it first, urgency is key, Guardian. We cannot fail.
If you want to know more about the Veil or feel like it hasn't properly been explained yet, this line is extremely frustrating. Osiris starts to explain why Callus getting the Veil would be bad, and then just trails off and doesn't finish the thought, insinuating that his audience should already understand what he means. Both of these lines are probably written this way to show Osiris struggling to cope with fear and grief, but this comes at the expense of audience understanding, and generally just comes comes off a little bit too annoying. Lines like this are a common trend early in Lightfall, which I think massively contributes to the perception that the campaign is confusing or poorly explained. Going through all of these quotes and carefully considering them, I think the Veil is actually set up and explained. However, those explanations are often indirect, vague, and require inference about what the characters mean, which is where the perception that Lightfall's story is confusing comes from. Even replaying Lightfall with the full knowledge of what the Veil is and what it does, I still felt really annoyed by all the vague posting from characters about what it is. Needing to think about the plot and what the story is trying to do isn't necessarily always a bad thing, as many stories that deal with metaphor and ambiguity often force you to think in order to engage with the story. However, Lightfall isn't really dealing in that kind of storytelling here, as none of the characters treat the Veil like a mystery. With stories who aren't really going for the mystery or ambiguity or metaphor route, the central conflict should be understandable while experiencing the story in linear time without needing to pause and think about what the characters mean. Throughout the campaign, the Veil's connection to the darkness and Strand is built up in a similar avoidant manner. I think if just a few instances of dialogue were changed to be more explicit and direct, this perception of the Veil being confusing and not set up would go away. We don't actually know what the Traveler's exact nature is or what its origins are, but it works as a MacGuffin because we have a tangible connection to it via ghosts, the light, and humanity's golden age. I don't think we need to fully understand the origins and nature of the Veil in Lightfall for it to be a compelling MacGuffin. We just need a more tangible personal connection to it. Lightfall largely assumes the player already knows and cares about the Veil, which leads to some frustration and dissonance for people who don't feel like they've been given enough explanation or justification. Later, a line of dialogue from the second mission sets up the radial mast and the witnesses' plans for the Veil.
You will link the radial mast and see the Veil destroyed. The final shape rests upon it.
Directly afterwards, Nimbus explains that the Veil being destroyed would be bad for Neomuna. They say,
If Callus uses whatever that radial thingy is and somehow destroys the Veil, well, it's tied directly to our Cloud Arc and literally all Neomuni. I don't think you need a Warlord translation for why that's bad.
This is an attempt to further justify the Veil's importance by tying it to the people of Neomuna. The problem is that it introduces another MacGuffin, the Cloud Arc, as a justification, but doesn't say what the Cloud Arc actually is, which makes the line about not needing a Warlord translation feel frustrating. The implication is that everyone in Neomuna is going to die if the Veil is destroyed, but just saying that outright would be better. It also doesn't help that we don't directly meet or see the inhabitants of Neomuna during Lightfall's campaign, aside from the Cloud Striders, so the threat of them being killed is less visceral and more abstract. The Cloud Arc is explained at the beginning of the fourth mission as a virtual reality powered by the Veil that the citizens of Neomuna live in.
It's our city's network, our infrastructure, our people, our defenses. Everything depends on it. All our citizens have uploaded their consciousness into the Cloud Arc. No Cloud Arc means lights out for everyone in Neomuna.
This is why Neomuna appears so empty. There are holograms that represent the people, but they're static and don't feel alive. This is a cool idea in concept, but bad in principle, because Neomuna doesn't feel inhabited, which makes a threat to it feel less real. If the holograms walked around and interacted with the environment more, even if it was just in a few cutscenes early on, it would help the audience empathize with the citizens more easily. This likely doesn't happen for budget or technical reasons, but it results in a worse story. At the end of the narrative, the witness is able to enter the Pale Heart to create the final shape without using the radial mass to destroy the Veil, so it's unclear what purpose in the plan destroying the Veil actually serves, or what the effect would have been for the broader worlds beyond Neomuna. In Lightfall, I don't think we need to understand the witness's entire backstory as some have suggested, but displaying its worldview through action would have helped the character feel more compelling. The witness's beliefs are hinted at a bit in previous campaigns, most notably in the final cutscenes for Shadowkeep and Witch Queen. The Witness not having anything to do in Lightfall results in people not understanding the character, feeling like it's a bad villain, or like it's not explained well enough. You could emphasize the Witness's worldview by having it save Lightbearers from the light by destroying their ghosts, and justifying that action verbally as having helped them. The point is to show what the Witness believes instead of just telling the audience through dialogue, making the character feel more visceral. Witch Queen and Final Shape's narratives feel good because their central conflicts pay off narrative beats that have been set up and reinforced robustly. Savathun's schemes in Witch Queen pay off narrative moments set up in the Red War, Forsaken, Shadowkeep, and Beyond Light. In the Red War, the setup is Savathun harvesting light from Guardians in Savathun's song. In Forsaken, it's the Dreaming City curse and Wish to Riven. In Shadowkeep, it's the manipulation of Crota's children. And in Beyond Light, it's impersonating Osiris and manipulating the last city to learn about the light. All of these established events are related to Savathun wanting to learn about the light, so she can take it for herself to protect the Traveler, and trying to make humanity stronger so that they can defeat the Witness. Witch Queen's main conflict is discovering how Savathun and her Lucent Brood acquired the light. This idea is set in motion with the discovery of Hive Ghosts in the first mission. The difference here is that Savathun's light is explicitly portrayed as a mystery, allowing us to accept that we don't fully understand her plan and motivations yet, but will by the end of the story, while Lightfall doesn't treat the nature of the Veil as a mystery. Portraying the Veil as mysterious also could have helped with perceptions of it being not properly explained. Instead, in Lightfall, every character seems to understand what it is without giving the player the details, again leading to that perception that it's not adequately explained. Witch Queen's mystery deepens in Altars of Summoning when the Guardian starts to observe Savathun's memories, and is paid off with the reveal of Savathun's resurrection, and that the Guardian has been helping her retrieve her memories the entire time. The climax of the expansion then gives us her motivation for acquiring the light, to protect the Traveler from the Witness. Her speech after her ritual is stopped about defeating the Witness being humanity's game to win or lose reinforces this idea and pays off the machinations in previous expansions that are designed to make humanity strong to survive the collapse. While Savathun's plan and motivations are complex, Witch Queen lays everything out in a way that makes Savathun's actions easy to understand once the central mysteries are resolved. Final Shape's central conflict is to prevent the Witness from using the Traveler's light to create the Final Shape and freeze the universe in an unchanging eternal stasis without entropy. This is set up in Season of the Deep with Asa's explanation of the Witness's origins, and further developed in the IntelliGenea lorebook. Even if you didn't engage with those pieces of setup, the opening cutscene of the expansion viscerally displays why stopping the Witness is necessary by showing the Final Shape visually. The Final Shape partially takes hold, freezing and dissecting Earth and its people into horrific abominations. The Traveler reverses the effect, but it becomes clear that the Final Shape would be terrible for the universe, and that the player needs to do everything they can to prevent it from occurring. The Witness's motivations are then solidified in the Descent mission with the Exuviation cutscene, where the Witness explains its creation and how it came to despise the Traveler. The Witness has several monologues talking about the chaos and entropy of the universe that it's trying to protect everyone from by enacting the Final Shape, which further reinforces its motivations. The entire expansion also serves as payoff for the cause of the collapse of humanity's golden age, what the Pyramid Fleet is, the nature of the Traveler, and why the Traveler abandoned countless species prior to humanity, which are set up in Destiny 1 and 2's vanilla campaigns, plus countless lore entries over the years. The problem with Lightfall's tone boils down to Bungie's writers not understanding player expectations based on the setup for the expansion. Lightfall serves as the beginning of open war against the Black Fleet and the Witness. There were 5 years of build-up leading alluding to the conflict that was incredibly grave, setting up the idea of an incredibly imposing and terrifying enemy. Key stories that set this tone include Shadowkeep, Season of Arrivals, Beyond Light, Witch Queen, and Season of the Seraph. I argue that Shadowkeep is most influential here because it's the first time the Pyramid Fleet becomes a main focus of the story and leans into horror elements like the nightmares, mysterious voices in the dark, and the witness possessing ghost. Even the musical motifs used to represent the Pyramid Fleet borrow heavily from horror. Characters discuss the return of the Black Fleet as a second collapse, foreshadowing an apocalyptic event. Whenever the pyramids were the focus of the narrative, the tone was consistently dark. Based on this setup, players who had been following the narrative leading up to Lightfall were expecting that the story would have a similar tone, as we were going to face the witness directly. Lightfall eschews the dark tone and delivers a mostly lighthearted expansion, inspired by cheesy 80s action movies, except for the opening, closing, and a few other cutscenes, which are fairly dark. Pretty much every storytelling aspect, from the writing to the visual aesthetic to the music and design, is inspired by pulpy 80s sci-fi and action movies. This tone didn't work for a lot of people because it's the exact opposite of what they were expecting, and not in a good way. Players were expecting a dire and intense battle, and instead got something campy, light, and comedic. While I don't think the idea of a lighthearted expansion is inherently unworkable, you can't deliver that when all of the setup is leading people to believe the tone will be serious. This is simply a case of failing to recognize the audience's expectations when making foundational story decisions. A lot of people blame Nimbus specifically for Lightfall's tone, and while yes, they are a big part of the problem, the issue wouldn't be solved simply by removing them. They're a side effect of the root problem, which is the writers picking the wrong tone, but received most of the backlash because they're the most overt example of that tone. Nimbus is designed as a comic relief character that's supposed to lighten the mood a bit. In dramas, comedic relief characters require a delicate balance tonally. Add too many jokes and it can undermine the narrative stakes. Add too few and your story might feel too oppressive or dark. Gallows humor in response to dark situations is a common human reaction and impulse to help cope with difficult emotions, so even the darkest stories can benefit from some level of comic relief. Final Shape has Cade serve as comic relief, and he finds the perfect balance of silly and serious for that story. Cade generally has more serious than silly moments, leading the tone to feel appropriate for the situation. The main problem with Nimbus is that they have too many jokes in ostensibly serious situations. Further complicating this is that if the jokes don't land, like most of Nimbus's don't, the character can become grating and frustrating. Aside from a few good jokes like making fun of Osiris,
You know, he gives off uptight museum volunteer vibes, but he's a nice guy when you catch him one-on-one.
and the untested Ishtar weapon bit,
If I can get this old Ishtar-era orbital beam thing up and running, might come in handy.
I would suggest exercising an abundance of caution around untested Ishtar technology.
I miss the old go in without a plan and hope for the best, Osiris.
That is a gross mischaracterization. Enemy tanks are headed to your position.
That sounds like a job for untested Ishtar weapon.
Many of Nimbus's jokes fall flat or don't match the tone needed for the story.
The uglier they are, the harder they fall, right? No? Come on.
Nimbus, that's literally her dad. However, just because they don't fit the tone, I don't think that means Nimbus is terrible, soulless, or shouldn't exist like some people suggest online. I think Nimbus would have been much better received had the cheesy jokes been cut back a bit, and more serious dialogue been added for them. The depth added by the post-campaign content, particularly the deterministic chaos mission, where they deal with their grief for Rohan, helps balance the comedic tone somewhat. I think the main campaign of Lightfall needed more of that side of Nimbus. I think what the writers are trying to do in Lightfall is portray Nimbus as an immature rookie who doesn't fully appreciate the gravity of the situation because of how new they are to being a Cloud Strider. Because they haven't had to take their job seriously yet, they're a bit too jokey. However, that jokiness clashes with the story a bit, getting annoying at times. My personal opinion is that yes, Nimbus is a bit of a writing failure, but people's reactions were a bit disproportionate to how big the problem actually is. In general, people on social media tend to overreact to things that are deemed cringy because a lot of internet culture is too irony poisoned to accept that things being earnest and failing might actually be better than not trying at all. It also is deeply unfortunate that Nimbus is Destiny's first non-binary character because a subset of the community took their negative reactions to Nimbus's tone as an excuse to reinforce existing prejudices and say transphobic stuff about them online. These people would still say awful things about Nimbus if their writing was actually good. However, the poor execution allowed bigotry to slide into the existing good faith conversation about the writing and acting, allowing legitimate criticism to be conflated with hate. This was bad for everyone involved because it made the conversation much more toxic, and spread hate as most people not informed on trans issues aren't adept at separating legitimate good faith criticism from hateful bullshit. This phenomenon isn't unique to Destiny, as it happens pretty much every time major media releases that involves trans people, and it's just really annoying to deal with as a trans person. And no, I'm not saying if you dislike Nimbus you're transphobic. I'm talking about people actually saying transphobic stuff. The situation is way more nuanced than a lot of people are able to appreciate. The final line of criticism surrounding Lightfall is about retcons. The word retcon is a portmanteau of retroactive continuity, which is the practice of introducing new information that changes the audience's understanding of previously established canon in a serialized story to justify or connect with a future installment. The most important retcon in Lightfall is the introduction of Neomuna as a human city that survived the collapse, which contradicts the idea that the last city is humanity's only city standing in the face of alien threats. A few justifications are provided for the retcon. Neomuna wanted to hide so they wouldn't be attacked. The Vex inserted a simulation into Neptune's magnetic field to hide activity on the planet, and a Cloud Strider left Neptune to erase humanity's data on Neptune from the Warmind database, so nobody would come looking and expose their location to external threats. I'm also guessing that when planning Neomuna, the writers looked at the original longer name for the last city, the last safe city on Earth, and thought to themselves that they weren't contradicting canon because Neomuna is on Neptune rather than Earth. The main issue I have with this retcon is that each human settlement you introduce, which miraculously survived the collapse, weakens the collapse narratively because it makes it seem less apocalyptic. Edge of Fate did something similar by introducing another settlement that survived the collapse, but I think the Ionians are a less egregious example due to their extreme isolation from the rest of the system out in the Oort Cloud. Lightfall continually reminds the player of the dissonance caused by this retcon by having inhabitants of Neomuna refer to the Guardians as warlords, calling back to post-collapse pre-city history. The other major retcon is the introduction of the Veil as the darkness's equivalent of the Traveler, and connecting it to the Black Heart from Destiny 1, which is then explained as an attempt by the Soul Divisive to create their own version of the Veil. Personally, I honestly think this retcon is fine, because it gives a better explanation for what the Black Heart actually is in Destiny 1. It also makes a lot of sense that there would be an equivalent of the Traveler for the Darkness. I would, however, like to see a bit more about how the Veil works and what it does, because it seems to be much more passive and inactive than the Traveler is with the Light. Most lore and narrative surrounding the Veil focuses on how different people attempt to use it than what its impacts on the rest of the universe are. However, the reason for this could be the distinction between light and darkness that Lightfall codifies, which says that the light connects to physical reality, while the darkness connects to memory and consciousness. The traveler acting out its will in the physical world would then be a manifestation of the light's physicality, and the veil's inaction would be a manifestation of its cerebral consciousness. However, even if the veil doesn't do stuff itself, I still would like to know a little bit more about it. I would love to get more information on what's going on with consciousness inside the veil. In general, I get a bit frustrated by the way retcons are frequently discussed online because the conversation almost always lacks nuance. Retcons are frequently discussed as a universally bad form of storytelling or a reason that a piece of fiction is poorly written. Apparently, a lot of people completely discount the fact that retcons can actually be executed well and enhance a story. I think the negativity comes down to the perception of retcons as lazy writing and the idea that perfectly consistent continuity is inherently better than inconsistent continuity. However, retcons aren't the same thing as continuity errors, where writers forget a past piece of lore and accidentally contradict it. Retcons are usually a deliberate choice to alter the interpretation of past events by clarifying ambiguity or changing firmly established facts to better support the future direction of the narrative. For example, let's consider a hypothetical movie where someone falls off a cliff and is presumed dead, so a funeral is held, but their dead body is never shown on screen. A future sequel where they're shown to have survived would be a retcon, as many people may have interpreted the character as having died because of the funeral. However, since the body was never shown, it was never explicitly confirmed that they died, and the funeral can be explained as other characters presuming they were dead without finding the body. This is an example of a retcon that clarifies the interpretation of ambiguous events. If we change the example to explicitly showing the person's dead body in an open casket funeral, it changes the retcon to directly contradict canon. However, what counts as a contradiction is complicated because it just needs to contradict how the original story was understood to be a retcon. It's easy to imagine a potential retcon where the person didn't die but was in a coma and reawakens in their casket in the sequel, having to escape being buried alive. This doesn't eliminate any of the previously established facts, and being buried alive is something that has occurred historically, although it's rare in modern times. Retcons that are simply clarifying interpretation and ambiguity are sometimes mistakenly explained as contradicting previously established facts, when people fail to recognize that their interpretation is not the literal plot of the story, and that other people might have legitimate disagreements with how they interpret events. Many people are so pigeonholed by their interpretations of stories that they're not even conscious of the fact that their understanding of the story is not universally held, and may become upset when someone disagrees with it. This lack of self-awareness and understanding then makes it difficult to have a nuanced conversation about canon because people can't separate what is explicitly stated by a text and what they have interpreted. I'm not trying to paint people who do this as ill-intentioned or mean-spirited, just ill-informed, as this is likely the byproduct of misremembering a text and only remembering your understanding of it. Seeing your own memory as infallible is a common bias, when in reality human memory is quite fallible and prone to error. This is something that's happened to me in the past, so I try to be careful about how I discuss stories to avoid doing this, and be empathetic when other people do it to me. The negative perception of retcons also is likely influenced by selection and confirmation biases, where people don't notice or discuss retcons that work for them, or that confirm their interpretations of the story. A lot of the time, what people are actually complaining about when they dislike retcons is the emotional dissonance they felt when it seemed to them like the story contradicted something they understood about it previously. They dislike how the retcon made them feel, so they complain about its existence. I'm not saying this to disparage anyone though, because this is how most media criticism actually works. People are trying to explain how the media makes them feel and why they felt that way. If the retcon didn't make them feel dissonance, they may not search for an explanation to their feelings on it and fail to identify the retcon. This isn't a moral failing, just an explanation of how bias like this works in practice. People are more likely to look for explanations or rationalize when they feel something strongly, and are less likely to if they don't have a strong reaction. There's a weird pseudo-intellectual tendency in some media criticism to discount the value provided by people's emotions and fetishize rationality and logic, leading to an insistence that emotional reactions do not provide value or insight, which I think is unhelpful at best and downright dishonest at worst. Subjective opinions based on emotional experience are just as valuable as objective facts for helping a criticism understand why a piece of media works or doesn't work for them. Sometimes they can even be more valuable. I personally view retcons as just another tool in a writer's toolkit for crafting serialized stories. I find the view that a perfect continuity with no wrinkles or retcons makes for the best possible story overly simplistic, because it doesn't allow for the possibilities that retcons permit. Sometimes a retcon can serve a story well and allow the storyteller to do something interesting that they wouldn't have been able to execute effectively without one. Often retcons happen because the original writer comes to regret a decision they made and decide to undo it so that future installments work better. Other times they happen because the media is written by a team of writers that isn't static, so someone disagrees with an earlier author's intent and decides to change things to continue the story. The only situation where retcons are completely avoidable in serialized stories is when all future entries of the story are finished before releasing the first part, allowing writers to go back and change decisions in earlier installments to better support future ones. An example of this would be The Lord of the Rings, which Tolkien wrote as a complete novel that was then broken into 3 volumes when it was published. This is in contrast to The Hobbit, which was released 17 years before The Lord of the Rings, retconned by The Lord of the Rings, and even republished with changes to reflect the retcon. Tolkien explains this metatextually in the prologue to The Fellowship of the Ring, as The Hobbit being Bilbo's slightly exaggerated retelling of his journey to find the ring, which was recorded in a book in universe, but later revised from notes by Samwise and Frodo to reflect what actually happened. Tolkien treats his Middle-earth books like historical texts that are translated and adapted from contemporary sources, and The Hobbit retcons are folded into this metatextual history by being sourced from conflicting accounts. The point of these examples is that you can do some interesting things with retcons if they're properly motivated and you treat them with care. It's also to show that some of our culture's most influential stories from pop culture employ retcons well. Returning to Destiny, you don't see people complaining about Witch Queen's retcons nearly as often as Lightfall, even though it has a similar number of them, because many people had positive emotional reactions to Witch Queen's retcons. They're integrated into the narrative in a way that doesn't lead to as much dissonance between the audience and the work, because they twist the Books of Sorrow in a satisfying and interesting way, adding a whole new dimension to the story, which fits the themes of cunning and trickery. Let's look specifically at how Witch Queen retcons the Books of Sorrow to illustrate this. Witch Queen's entire story is about Savathun, the Queen of Lies herself, and a major theme is discerning what is truth and what is manipulation. The Books of Sorrow is the foundational text on the Hive, framed as a religious retelling of the Hive's history, put together as a text by Oryx's brood. They're the history of the Hive as Oryx wants it remembered. The Books of Sorrow tell us that the Hive started out weak, as prey called krill on a world full of predators, destined to live short lives. The siblings have their lives changed when Teox betrays their father, the Osmium King, and helps the helium drinkers depose and kill him. This happens because their father listened to the words of his dead worm familiar. The siblings escape and make an oath for revenge. They listen to the worm familiar as it tells them to dive deep into the ocean. This leads the sisters to the worm gods, with whom they make a bargain with for immortality that allows them to return to the Osmium Kingdom empowered as Hive and defeat the helium drinkers. The Hive siblings start out as underdogs, trying to do anything to survive. Their entire story is about how a desire to live can lead you to become an oppressor, as the Hive siblings become super predators, wiping out entire civilizations because their worm gods demand it. it, and should they disobey, their worms will consume them. It's about the dilemma of balancing morality and survival. In the Books of Sorrow as originally written, the worm gods are the primary agent manipulating and driving the hive to make their Faustian bargain. The winnower also exists but doesn't directly manipulate the hive. Rather, Oryx deduces that the worm gods are hypocrites for not following the sword logic, leading him to kill Akka and commune with the deep and the winnower. Witch Queen retcons the Books of Sorrow by adding layers on top of the original worm bargain. Using Savathun's worm, Ikora discovers the manipulations of the Witness and Rulk, coercing the worm gods into bargaining with the Krill to make the hive, preying on the worm gods' need to survive, in the same way the worm gods prey on the Krill and hive's need to survive. The Witness does this to prevent the Traveler from choosing the Krill as a light-blessed species as it arrives to their home planet, Fundament. In my opinion, this makes the themes of the original text even stronger by introducing the idea that the worm gods themselves were merely trying to survive when they manipulated the Krill and the hive. This is efficient storytelling because it serves three narrative purposes simultaneously: grounding Savathun's acquisition of the light in her history, introducing the idea that the Traveler planned to bless the hive in the distant past, establishing the Witness as a credible threat, and grounding it in the pantheon of the hive by adding it as a layer on top. The themes of cunning, lies, and discerning the truth are fantastic tools to use when introducing retroactive continuity, because they prime the viewer to accept retcons as truths that were hidden between the lines of the original text. The retcon reveals that even Savathun, the Queen of Lies herself, was lied to. She has been mostly honest during the events of Witch Queen, and was manipulated by a greater cunning than herself. In a role reversal, Savathun, who is essentially the villain of the expansion, serves as an audience surrogate when this is revealed. The vision from her worm is shown to her, which leads to her response.
No, that's not what happened. The Traveler never came to us. We were forced to choose the deep. How could I have missed this?
Later, she says,
"So you're the expert now? The expert on me, on the hive, on trickery. Is that what you really think? Go on then. You know so much. Tell me who I am."
Savathun responds to the retcon with disbelief because it contradicts what she previously knew about her history, mirroring the situation the audience is in, as they have preconceived notions of the hive's history challenged and rewritten by the retcon. Savathun then responds in anger, dismissing the retcon but gradually coming to accept it. Through Savathun, the writers enact a cunning manipulation of the audience by portraying the emotional experience of someone encountering a retcon and gradually coming to accept its place in the canon, walking the audience towards acceptance via empathizing with a character on screen. Savathun is also the antagonist, and she's framing the protagonist, the Guardian, as already accepting the retcon as true, which subtly leads the player to identify the retcon as truth, manipulating us towards acceptance. The Books of Sorrow as written have an aspect that works in the retcon's favor. The 41st fragment, Dreadnought, contains the following passage. Saith Oryx, I will prepare for long voyages. I am Savathun, insidious. Into the war. I graffiti this notice to you. Into the deep. These books are full of lies. The original text of the Books of Sorrow hedges against future retcons by having Savathun graffiti Oryx's history, saying that the story is full of lies. This originally serves two purposes: to make the reader carefully consider what they're reading by hinting that some of the story is propaganda, and to reinforce Savathun's nature as a god of trickery by adding a degree of uncertainty to the story. The audience then has to decide decide whether to believe the narrative presented, or to believe Savathun, who says it's full of lies. However, if Savathun is lying, she's gained power by tricking the audience into believing one of her lies. It allows any future dissonance related to the Books of Sorrow to be explained away as the lies or half-truths Savathun was referencing. This is the masterstroke of the whole retcon, because it works on pretty much every level. It's genius writing that grounds the retcon thematically with the themes of Witch Queen and the Books of Sorrow, while reducing the possibility of emotional dissonance at every turn. In the end, people who dislike the retcon have to face the fact that the Books of Sorrow themselves say that they don't contain pure facts and truth. There is ambiguity and lies within the story. I feel like I've already spent too much time talking about retcons, and the Final Shapes retcons are an even more complicated topic, so I'm not going to discuss them here. They reinterpret the Books of Sorrow and Unveiling, but with much more ambiguity and room for interpretation. The actual issue with Lightfall's retcons is uncareful use of them without fully considering the implications. Personally, I don't think the Neomuna retcon does anything interesting, while on the other hand, I think the Veil retcon is justified because the writers do a lot of interesting thematic work with the Veil. Pretty much none of that work is in Lightfall itself and is all in future stories. In contrast, I think Witch Queen demonstrates that it's possible to pull off a retcon brilliantly. Lightfall's legacy is as a fundamentally flawed expansion that may have doomed its developer. Witch Queen was always going to be a tough act to follow as one of the most critically acclaimed expansions in Destiny history, but the unforced errors in Lightfall's storytelling and design consigned it to be regarded poorly by its audience. After reconsidering everything, I think the discussion and reactions to Lightfall are a bit hyperbolic. Some discuss it like it's the worst Destiny experience ever, as the incentives of social media tend to completely obliterate any sense of nuance, and tend to reward highly inflammatory hyperbole and hot takes. Now, I regard Lightfall as a bit of a disappointment, but certainly not the worst story Bungie has ever told, as it has at least some redeeming qualities like the gameplay being fun for the most part, and the beginning and ending being pretty good all things considered. I think Lightfall deserves criticism for its mistakes, but still think it's a little underrated in spite of its problems. I've come to view it even a little bit more positively than I did back in 2023. I also think it's depressing that so many talented creatives had to lose their job over its poor performance. This outcome says more about Bungie than Lightfall itself, as in any stable company, one misstep shouldn't lead to such a catastrophic outcome. A well-run company would have been able to survive revenue shortfalls without needing to immediately lay off employees, but Bungie's bad financial decisions came to roost with Lightfall, and it was lower-level employees who bore the cost. All in all, I wouldn't be putting this much energy into critiquing Lightfall if I didn't love Destiny and want the best for the game, so I hope Bungie can learn from its mistakes and deliver better stories and expansions in the future. I wrote that sentence in July before The Edge of Fate came out. Things are looking pretty bleak right now. Surely Renegades will save Destiny. I was really hoping to not end this video on a bleak note, but we are where we are. Let me know in the comments what your take on Lightfall is. Do you agree or disagree with my analysis? And if so, why? As always, thank you to everyone for watching.